Hey, what's up? This is Justin from Lesser Dog Tutorials, and today we will be doing the second portion of our interactions section of the 2D point-and-click adventure game tutorial series in Unreal. And we're going to be kind of doing a bunch of different things here, so I apologize if it seems confusing. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I'll try to answer them. So let's start things off by opening up the widget blueprint for the HUD, and we can remove everything that's in here and just leave the event tick for now. And what we'll be doing first is adding a macro called mouse over UI, and this is going to help determine whether or not the mouse is over the UI so that we can choose to do certain actions or not do them. So add the in and out exec pins, and we can put that right at the beginning of event tick, and then we'll go ahead and add the logic in here. So open it up and spread out the input and output nodes so we have some room. And then we're going to first add a variable, which is going to be a reference to the player controller. So make sure you change the variable type to our BP Adventure controller. And then you can drag it in, and then from the controller, we're going to get the is over UI bool. And you can drag out from that and find the not node, and then add the is hovered node. And we're going to check if both of these are true, so we use the AND node. And what we're doing here is saying, if is over UI is not true and we are hovered over this, then we need to set it to true. So from the player controller, you can set is over UI to true. Make sure you tick that box. So basically what we're doing is we're just saying if the mouse is over the UI, then make sure on player controller is over UI is set to true, and vice versa. If the mouse is not over the UI, then set is over UI to false. This is just a way for us not to repeatedly set this bool to true over and over and over again, or false over and over and over again. We want to check if we should set it to false or we should set it to true before we actually do the setting of the bool. So we're doing the same thing on the other side, but we're moving that not node to the is hovered. So we're seeing if it's not hovered over the UI and that bool is set to true, that bool shouldn't be set to true, so switch it to false. And then I like to make sure that every pin leads to the output pin. And then just like before, I like to do a comment box around everything just to help understand what's happening. So back over in the event graph, we're going to set the player controller variable. Also in event tick right at the beginning, we want to check to see that the player controller is valid before we move on to the mouse over UI macro. And then to set the player controller, we're going to do that on event construct. So when the widget is constructed, that's when we'll set it. So get the player controller, and from that we'll cast to our adventure controller, and then we'll set it to the player controller variable. All right, now let's set up the UI to actually reflect what it is we're doing. So if you open the interaction widget blueprint, we can rename the text block to something like interaction description, and then make sure you tick that is variable box right next to the name. And then in the graph, we can add a new variable that will be called text locked. Make sure it's a bool. And then we'll add a new function called set text. And then we drag in the bool of text locked, and we're going to branch from that and make sure that the text is not locked. And if it's not locked, that's when we'll set the text. But we need to know what text to set, so we'll add an input parameter, and we'll call that text to set. and we'll change the type to a string. And if you drag in the interaction description variable we made by ticking that box, you can drag out from it and find the set text node, and the text to set can be connected to that, and it will automatically convert it to what it needs to be. So we can compile and save that. And we'll add a new function that we're going to call highlight text. So the first thing you do in this is set the text locked to true. You can drag in the interaction description, and we're going to set the color and opacity. And if you right click in color and opacity, you can split the struct, and then select the color that it's going to be and change it to hex sRGB D79115FF. And once you get that color, you can drag it up to the top and save it for later. Now add a new function that we're going to call reset text color, and this will change it back to how it originally was. And so we'll set text locked to false, bring in the interaction description, do the same thing as before, set color and opacity, split the struct, and change the color to 7D652AFF. And if you haven't already saved that color, be sure to do so. The next thing that we're going to do in here is reset what the text is. So if you drag in the set text node, and if we leave the text to set to blank, it'll change it to nothing. And so you can close that, and we don't need that for now. And back in the HUD blueprint, and what we're going to do is add a function that we'll call set interaction text. And this is the function we'll be calling from external sources to set the text. So if you drag in the interaction widget blueprint variable, and from that we'll just pull the set text node and set that off to the side for now. And then drag in the player controller, and from that we'll need to get the active verb, pull up from the verb and append the string. And in the B slot, just add a space, and then add another pin. And then from the player controller, we'll be getting the target hotspot. And then from that, we're getting the hotspot description that we made. And then that goes into the C pin of append. And the return value of append goes to the set text node. Now, at the beginning, we're checking if the hotspot is valid first. And if it is valid, we'll go to that set text node. But if it's not valid, we're instead just going to show the verb, not the hotspot description. So we're basically only going to need the active verb for this section, and that just goes into the text to set. So basically this is just checking if there is a target hotspot to add to the verb, then add it to the verb. If it's not there, then it's just going to show the verb. So over in the adventure controller, we have our two event dispatchers, but we're going to add another one, and we're going to call this one update interaction text. And this event is going to update the interaction text every time we call it. So anytime something changes, like we select a new verb or we have a new hotspot active, this needs to be called. So the first thing we're going to do is call it on event begin play. So it will update the text just to say walk to. The next time we want to do it is in assign verb, because once we assign the verb, we want to update what the text says. So we call it there. The next time we'll want to call it is going to be when the mouse enters the hotspot zone. So you can delete everything that's there, and the first thing we'll do is we'll set the target hotspot, and then we'll call the update interaction text, and it should pull whatever that hotspot is and put it into the text. The next place that we'll call it is the mouse exit hotspot, and what this is going to do is reset it, so all it shows is the verb, which would be walk to if nothing was selected. So we want to check here first if we're doing a hotspot interaction, which means we're walking towards a hotspot to perform a verb on it. And if we are, we're not wanting to reset it. But if we're not, so if it's false, set the target hotspot to none and then call the update interaction text event. Now let's talk about these event dispatchers. So we have three of them: begin action, interrupting action, and update interaction text. Now what these do is they send out a signal, and any blueprint listening for this signal will perform an action that is assigned to it. So here's how it works. So in the HUD widget blueprint, we're going to add 3 custom events that correspond with the event dispatchers that we made in the player controller. So the first one will be called Update Interaction Text Event. And then the second one will be called Begin Action Event. And the third will be called Interrupt Action Event. So let's now decide what these events do before we link them up. So the Update Interaction Text event is going to set interaction text. And then the Begin Action event is going to highlight the text, which is found on the Interaction widget blueprint. So if you grab that reference and you drag out from that, we can run that highlight text function. And then the Interrupt Action event is going to reset the color and the text. So we need to do 2 things. So the first thing, we'll drag the Interaction widget blueprint reference, and from that, we'll do the reset text color. And then after that, we'll bring in the widget blueprint reference for the verbs. And what that's going to do is run the clear selection function. So now that these are performing the tasks they need to do, we now need to link up the actual events to the event dispatchers. So in the event construct at the end where the player controller is set, drag out from the player controller. And if you search for a bind event 2, you can see that we have our 3 event dispatchers here. So if you were to select the begin action, you'll notice the event input pin on it. It can be connected to the square, the red square on any given event, and now it's going to be set up so that the event will fire every time the dispatcher is called. An alternate way to do this, which cleans things up a little bit, is if you drag out from the event pin, you can create another custom event, and this event instead will be fired every time the dispatcher is called. But all you have to do is connect the event you made earlier to the end of this event, and now it will fire the actual event you have down here. And it just basically adds another event to fire, another custom event, but it cleans it up so you don't have wires all over the place. It kind of just decouples the event from the bind event function. So now we can go ahead and we can add the other 2 that we need, and you can create a custom event for each one. You can really name it whatever you like. What I like to do is just name it the exact same name as the event I want to fire, but I just add the word fire at the beginning. So fire begin action event, or fire interrupt action event. So basically what I'm doing is I'm naming it what it's doing. It's firing this event. And then make sure that you have all 3 of them hooked up and firing the correct event they need to fire. And make sure also that the player controller reference is connected to each of these. Okay, now that that is set up, we can compile and save, and we can test out how it works. So select the poster, and in the hotspot description, type in the word poster. And now, if you play, everything should be updating correctly. So using a verb, you use the poster, you walk to it, it'll say, I can't use that, or whatever text you put in. Look at poster, same thing. He actually says the specific looks like a poster to me, which is good. However, we have still one small issue. If you're walking to the poster and you press another verb, it'll switch the verb, the active verb, to the one you selected before you got there. So let's update that real quick. So open the WBP verbs and get into the graph and unhook the adventure controller. And we're going to run that before set style. So put set style at the end there. And then from clear selection, that goes to the adventure controller. And then from the adventure controller, we can get the clear current path function, which then can go to the set style. And so just clean up the lines here. And then make sure that assign verb is hooked up to the adventure controller reference too. And now when you click a verb, it'll clear the selection, it'll clear the current path, set the new style and the new active verb, which will interrupt the walking and set the new verb active. So now we can test it out and interrupt the walking too by clicking other verbs, by clicking in different places to walk to. Everything is working well. So it interrupts when it needs to, it switches the verb when it needs to, and that's good. I guess now we want to actually have text above the player that he can say things and not just do a print string. So in the video's description, you'll see a zip file on Google Drive. So go ahead and download that and then move the fonts in there, which is just 2 fonts, into your fonts folder and import those into your project. Now let's create the widget that we need in order to show this text. So in the widgets folder, create a new widget blueprint, and we'll call this WBP_bark text. And we'll open that up, and the first thing we'll do is drag a text box onto the canvas panel. And then change on the top right, change it from fill screen to desired. And then what we'll need to do is wrap the text with an overlay. And then with the text box selected, do the horizontal alignment to fill and then the vertical alignment to align to the bottom. And then select the overlay and right click it, and we'll wrap that with a size box. And then if you right click the canvas panel, we can replace with child so that the size box is at the top. And then we'll do the width and height override on the size box, and the width will do 800 and the height will do 180. Now select the overlay and make sure that that's filled vertically and horizontally, and then select the text box and then make sure it's set to center justification. And then with that text box selected, we're going to select our lesser dog bark font, just the normal one. And it won't look legible, but that's because we still need to add the outline. So if you duplicate the text block and select the outline font for this one and change the color to black, you'll see that now there is a very blocky outline on it. There might be a better way to do this, but this is the best way I found so far. If I find a better way, I'll let you know. So select the top text block and we'll rename it to base text, and make sure you tick the is variable box. And then select the other text block and name it outline text, and also select the variable so that they're both here in the graph. Now create a new function that we'll call set bark text. And we want to add an input parameter we'll call bark that's of a type string. And all we're going to do is drag in our new base text and outline text variables and run a set text function and hook them both up to the target. Then select the bark, hook that up to in-text, and make sure that the exec pins are connected. And that's all we need to do for this function. And before we leave, we want to make sure both of the text blocks are set to 27 for the font size. And since this is a visual element, we're going to add this to the adventure character blueprint. And so if you add a component in the top left, you can search for widget, and we'll add that, and we'll name this bark widget. And if on the right side in the details panel, you can see under user interface, set the space to screen, draw size to 800 by 180. And then in the widget class dropdown, we're going to change that to the bark text widget blueprint. And then on event begin play, right at the end there, we're going to bring in the bark widget. And from that, we'll get user widget object. And then the return value will cast to the bark widget blueprint that we made. And then the last thing we need to do is set the bark text. And we will set it to nothing because this is the beginning of the game and we want nothing to appear there until we tell it to appear there. So with that in mind, let's make a couple functions. The first one we'll call player bark, and the next one we'll call clear bark. So for the player bark function, what we want to do is add a variable that's going to be called isBarking to know if we are saying something. And so we can branch from that, and then if it's true, we'll need to clear the bark text. So if he's already barking, then we're going to clear it and add new bark text. And if he's not barking, then we're just going to go straight to setting isBarking to true. So we'll want to add the input pin of what we're going to be barking. So add an input of a type string. And then if you go back to the event graph, you can grab the set bark text functions that we placed earlier and just put that here. And then we'll need to link up what text will be barked there. So now the text will be set, but we need to clear it. So we can't exactly put a clear bark right at the end here because it will not be on the screen for very long. So we'll create a custom event back in the event graph that we will call bark delay, which you need to run like timelines and delays and things in the actual event graph, which is why we're doing custom events here. And then we'll make another one called bark reset, and then add a timeline, and you can just call it bark timeline. But the bark delay will have to be hooked up to the play from start, and the bark reset will stop the timeline. And so you can hook up clear bark to finished, and so when the timeline's done, it will clear it. So if you double click it, open it up, set the length to 3, you can compile and save, and 3 seconds is pretty good. You can set it to whatever you want. So now we need to run bark delay at the end of the player bark function. So now when the character says something, it will be 3 seconds until the text disappears. So if you open the clear bark function, the first thing we'll want to do is set isBarking to false, and then we'll set the bark text to nothing. And then at the end, we're running the bark reset custom event, which stops the timeline on the event graph. So when the player barks, we will check to see if he's already barking. If he is, he clears the bark, which will set the bark text to nothing, reset the timeline, and then sets the new bark text, which will run the bark delay. And then the timeline proceeds to wait 3 seconds and then clears the bark. So now we just need to make the adventure controller hook up to the character's bark function. So if we open the adventure controller, we can create a function called showBark, and we'll have an input of a type string called bark text, drag in the player character, and we'll run the player bark function that we made, and then hook up the bark text to the input there. So now just to fire these actual events, they're going to be associated with the hotspot currently. So if you open the BP hotspot blueprint, we'll add a function called bark. And what we'll need to do is we'll get the player controller and then we'll cast to our adventure controller. And as the adventure controller, we'll do the show bark function. And of course, we'll do the bark text string again as the input parameter and hook that up to the show bark. So in the event graph, all we'll need to do is replace the print strings with our bark function. And you can just copy the string into the bark text section, delete the print string, and hook up the bark function. Do that for each of these verb functions. And then be sure to open the hotspot poster blueprint and replace that with the bark function also. So now if we test it out, we'll see how it looks. So if we use the poster, okay, that pops up, but it's on the bottom of the character. So we want to fix that. If you go to the viewport of the adventure character and switch it to top and lit, you can just select the bark widget and we'll just move it up, above the character. And we try picking it up. I can't pick that up. Good. That looks like it's in the right position. Now let's test if it goes away after 3 seconds, and it does. And what if we use 2 verbs at once? We'll replace it, and it does. So that's working well. Before we move on, let's clean up some of this stuff. So in the blueprints folder, I'm going to make an enums folder, and I'm going to move all the enums in there. I'll make another folder called hotspots, and I'll put hotspot related blueprints in there. And then you'll see I have something called show redirectors on. And for some reason, when you move things around in Unreal, it has a redirector. It's really stupid, annoying to deal with. But in order to see these, you click the filters button, and other filters you'll see show redirectors. And if you want to clear these up all at once, right click your main folder and click fix up redirectors in folder. So back in the blueprints folder, we'll create another folder called interfaces, and we'll throw in our verb interaction interface. And then I think another folder will work called characters, because we're going to have a few of those probably in our game, and move in our player character in there. And we'll just leave the rest of it out in the blueprints folder. So now we're going to reconfigure a bunch of stuff. So in the adventure controller, it's going to have left mouse button, it's going to go to get clicked, and then from hotspot, all we're going to do is walk to hotspot and then perform interaction. And at the bottom, from nothing, it will be clear current path, walk to location. Just make sure you delete everything except for those things for now. And then to clean up the functions, we can add a category called controller, and we'll just move all of the functions except for show bark into that category. Our goal now is to set up a way to have a sequence of events that we can add to and remove from whenever we want to. So now I want to delete the show bark function. I know we just made it, but things happen, things change. So if we open the hotspot blueprint and open up the bark function, just delete the last node there since that function doesn't exist anymore. In the event graph of the hotspot, we'll want to add an event begin play node, and then we'll set a player controller variable that we can reuse later instead of casting to the adventure controller every time. So for the begin cursor over and end cursor over, we can just use that player controller reference that we got in the event begin play instead of casting again. All right, with that out of the way, we can head over to the bark function, and we can replace these nodes, this cast here, with our player controller variable. And what we'll need to do is fire a function on player controller and pass in the bark text to something. So if we go to the adventure controller blueprint, we can add a variable called bark text and set it to the type string. And then while we're at it, we can add a category that we'll just call task data and put it in there. And then we can create another category called references and put the HUD, the player controller, and target hotspot and current path in there. Clean things up a bit. And so now that we have the bark text, we can head back to the hotspot blueprint, and we will set the bark text using the text parameter. So now we need to fire something to show the bark. So we can create an event in the adventure controller that we will call task bark. And this will take that bark text reference and actually show the bark that we need. So drag in the player controller and we'll do the player bark. And since we set that bark text reference, we can use that to plug into the bark text parameter. So now that we have that, the only thing left to do in the hotspot blueprint is to fire that task bark event that we made. So if we test it out, the character will walk to the hotspot and then bark the text. However, it doesn't face the direction anymore because we removed that. So we could create a new custom event on the adventure controller where we can do specifically that. So we'll call it task face direction, and then drag in the player character reference, and from that we'll fire the set facing direction function. Now the only thing, just like the bark text, we need a variable to hold the facing direction. So we'll create a new variable called facing direction, set it to the type enum facing direction, and then we'll put it in the task data category. and we'll plug it in to the set facing direction function. So back over in the hotspot blueprint in the event graph, let's create a new function that we'll call face hotspot. And in that function, we'll get the player controller and get the target hotspot, and then we'll check if it's valid using the macro is valid, where it has the is valid, is not valid output pins. And then we'll drag in the player controller and we'll set the facing direction only if the target hotspot is valid, and the facing direction will be the target hotspot's facing direction. And then we will run the task face direction on the player controller. So if we put the new face hotspot function in between the verb events and the bark function, then the character should face the direction that we specify in the details panel when we put hotspot out into the level. Go ahead and add a new function that we're going to call clear verb. And the reason that we're making this, if we were to save and play, you would see that while we can use a verb on the poster, he'll walk to it and turn, the verb won't clear. The text will remain highlighted. So we'll need to specify that the verb needs to be cleared. So in the clear verb function, get the player controller and run interrupt action, which will stop the movement of the character, reset the verb, reset the hotspot, and set hotspot interaction to false, and call interrupting action. And then this function will go right after the bark function on each of these verb events. Cool, so let's test it out and see if it works as we expect. Yep, it clears, the character walks to it, turns, says the thing that he wants to say, and then that clears the verb. This is exactly what we had before, but now it's a lot more customizable. So open the hotspot poster blueprint, and we can disconnect the bark from the event on look at, and drag out from the event and look for switch on int. And then we can add a few pins. And this is the thing that we're going to use to do our sequence of events, and it's going to be based on this integer called selection. What that means is if the selection number is 0, it'll run the 0 pin. If it's 1, it will run the 1 pin, etc. So we can determine which one is running at any given time based on that integer. Let's go ahead and see it in action. So create a function that will be called face direction. Create another one called wait, and then add another that we'll call this one begin task interaction, and another one that we'll call end task interaction. So we could drag out, say on 0, we will do begin task interaction, and then on 1, we can do face hotspot, and then on 2, we can do the bark that we have here already. And then let's say the third one will be face another direction. So we'll do face direction. And let's set up the face direction function. So inside the face direction function, add an input parameter called facing direction of the type enum facing direction. Drag in the player controller, and we're going to set the facing direction on the player controller based on the input that we put here. And then after that, we'll run that event that we made earlier called task face direction. And in the poster blueprint, I just chose down as the direction to face. And then on number 4, make sure you add the other pin. We'll do a new bark. And for this one, we'll just say something like, man, what a poster. And then when we want to end the sequence, we'll just choose this default output pin. And then we'll use that to run the function called end task interaction. So in order to run these in a sequence, we just need to set this selection integer to the number that corresponds with each function. And in order to do that, we'll need to set up some sort of variable that we can change. So if we go to the adventure controller, we'll just add a variable, and we'll call it task index. And we'll change that type to integer, and we could put it in the task data category. Now, back in the poster hotspot, we can get the player controller reference, which is from the hotspot blueprint. And from the player controller, we will get the task index that we made, and we can hook that up to the selection input pin. Now, in the adventure controller, let's create another function called increment task index. And you guessed it, this is going to increment the task index. So let's create a new variable. And it's going to be a bool called isPerformingTaskInteraction. We need a way to tell if we should be incrementing the task index or not. So this bool should be checked right at the beginning of this function. And if it is performing a task interaction, that's when we're going to be incrementing the task index. So get the task index variable, and from it, we're going to hit plus plus. And that's going to get the increment int macro, which increases the index by 1. So at the end, once it's been incremented, we're going to perform the interaction again. And the reason we're doing that is because it will run the current active verb event again, but with an increased task index, which means it'll move to the next output pin on the switch node. So let's start filling out these functions and increase the task index where it's needed. So in the adventure character script, right here in the event graph, we're going to get the player controller cast to the adventure controller, and then increase the task index at the end of this whole bark timeline function. So now that that's done, we want to make sure that we know that that's done. So in the adventure controller, at the end of the player bark function, we'll just do a reroute node, put a comment on it, and we'll say that it increments the index on the adventure character blueprint. That way we'll just know if we ever glance at it where the index increase is happening. So now in the set facing direction area of the adventure controller, at the end we can increment the task index also, but that means it's going to increase the task index and perform the next one immediately. So let's add a little bit of a delay in between the set facing direction and the increment task index of 0.2. That way it'll be a little bit of a separation between the two. Now let's add another custom event that we'll call task wait. And then we'll need a variable to tell us how long that the wait should last. So we'll just call it wait time, set the type to float, and move it into the task data category. Then we can drag it into the event graph and get it, and run a delay using this variable instead of a duration that we type in. And then, of course, at the end, we want to increment the task index. Hopefully you see now kind of what I'm going for. We can create any number of events in this graph that will be called from specific hotspot blueprints or any other blueprint that can make our character do anything we want him to do. So in the adventure controller, let's add another function, and we're going to call it endTaskInteraction. And it's going to be the same name as the function in the hotspot. What this function will do will be setting the task index back to 0. It'll set the isPerformingTaskInteraction to false. And it will run the interrupt action function, resetting everything. And then we'll add another function called begin_task_interaction. And remember, this is ran at the beginning of the sequence of the switch on int node. And so what this does is it sets the isPerformingTaskInteraction to true, and it increments the task index. So it will move to the next task. Now over in the hotspot blueprint, in the begin task interaction function, we're going to get the player controller, and then we're going to run begin task interaction on that blueprint. And then the end task interaction function on the hotspot will run the end task interaction function on the player controller. So now go to the adventure controller and open up the get clicked macro. That's where we're going to check if we are performing a task interaction or not. And if we're not performing a task interaction, then we're going to continue to cast to the hotspot and all the rest. All right, compile and save that. And now we want to open up the mouse enter hotspot, because what we need to do is make sure we're not resetting the target hotspot. So if you drag in is performing task interaction, drag in also hotspot interaction, both of these bools, and from them we're going to do an or node, and then we're going to branch from that and see if either one of these are happening, because if they are, we don't want to do anything. Otherwise, we will continue forward and set the target hotspot and call update interaction text as normal. And then if you open the mouse exit hotspot, we're going to do something similar. Well, not just similar, we're going to do the exact same thing and do the same check. I know we're doing a lot, but we only have one more thing to do. And we're going to open the widget blueprint for the verbs and open up the set clicked style function. So now what we want to do is kind of spread this stuff out, because we're going to move clear selection after we cast the adventure controller. So you can drag the adventure controller cast near the beginning and drag that stuff out and separate it a bit, because we're going to add something else in here. Make sure clear current path is still connected. And then from the adventure controller, we're going to look for is performing task interaction and branch from that. And only if it's false will we actually move forward with the rest of this function. And make sure everything is hooked up as it needs to be. Now we can test it out and see how this works. If we use the poster, it'll walk to it and do the normal interaction like we want. If we look at, here's our special function, and it is running. He turned, he said, man, what a poster, and now it's over. So we can move again. And remember, if you click around anywhere while this task sequence is operating, nothing will happen. You can't do anything to get out of it. You can only interrupt it as you're walking to it, and once it begins, it is now permanently performing the action. So that does it for the interaction section. That was very complex. I apologize for it. If you have any questions, leave a comment. If you like the series, please like the video, and please follow if you're not already, and I will see you in the next video.